"Security will escort you out, Ms. Whitaker." Those 6 words hit me before I could even draw a full breath. I was standing at the head of the boardroom table, the exact spot where I had stood every single Monday morning for 4 years straight. The same long table. The same city skyline stretched out through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me. The same familiar faces sitting in the same familiar chairs. Except today, 2 security guards were posted by the door like I was a stranger who had wandered in off the street. And not one board member would look at me. Except Victor Langford. He was leaning back in his chair with his fingers neatly folded on the table, watching me the way a man watches something he has already decided the outcome of. "The board has voted," he said, his voice perfectly smooth and unhurried, "to remove you as CEO. Effective immediately." My throat tightened. No phone call. No warning meeting. Not a single conversation. Just a vote that had clearly been taken before I walked through that door. Victor slid a thick brown envelope across the table toward me. "And since you are no longer CEO," he added, almost gently, "the performance bonus scheduled for next month is no longer applicable." $500,000. Gone in one sentence. The security guard shifted his weight by the door. Something cold and steady settled deep inside my chest. Because they had not read my contract carefully enough. The elevator doors closed in front of me with a quiet, final click. I stood very still and stared at my own reflection in the polished steel. The woman looking back at me had tired eyes and a tight jaw and was gripping a box of personal items so hard her knuckles had gone completely white. "My name is Lauren Whitaker. I was 40 years old. And I had just been removed as CEO of Calloway Industries, the company I had spent 4 years dragging back from the edge of total collapse. The company whose logo was still printed on the security badge now sitting cold and useless in my blazer pocket. They had fired me 14 days before my $500,000 performance bonus was due. No cause given. No warning offered. Just a vote held quietly in a room I used to run. I should have felt destroyed walking out of that building. Part of me did. But underneath the anger and the humiliation and the sharp burning sting of it all, something else was very much alive inside me. Because 4 years earlier, on a quiet Tuesday night at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee sitting beside me, I had added one single clause to my employment contract. Just one clause. A clause that nobody on that board had ever bothered to read closely. And the moment Victor Langford signed my termination paperwork, he had set something in motion that no one in that boardroom was going to be able to stop. To understand where that clause came from, you have to go back 4 years before that elevator ride. Back then I was Callaway's Chief Operations Officer. I was 36 years old, younger than almost everyone in leadership, and I had learned early to keep my mouth shut and my eyes wide open. On an ordinary Thursday afternoon I sat in the same boardroom, not at the head of the table, but 2 seats down on the left, and watched the previous CEO, a man named Dale Forrester, walk out carrying a cardboard box. No farewell speech. No handshake from anyone. No acknowledgement of the decade he had given that company. Just silence. After the door closed, Victor Langford leaned back in his chair and said something I never once forgot. "Timing matters in business." Casual. Relaxed. Delivered like a thought about the weather. I did not respond. But I listened past the surface of the words. Later, I found out the full truth. Dale had been fired exactly 3 weeks before a major bonus milestone came due. His contract had no protection clause. The board had saved themselves millions of dollars in a single afternoon. It was not an accident. It was not coincidence. It was a deliberate strategy executed by people who believed they were completely untouchable. I sat across from Dale's empty chair and made a quiet, unspoken promise to myself that afternoon. If I ever sat at the head of that table, nobody would do the same thing to me. 6 months after Dale Forrester walked out with that cardboard box, Victor Langford called me into his private office and closed the door behind me. The company was in serious trouble. Revenue had dropped for 3 straight quarters. 2 of our biggest long-term clients had quietly moved on. The hallways felt hollow. People barely spoke in the elevator anymore. Victor sat across from me with his hands folded on his desk and a carefully constructed expression of concern. "We need someone steady," he said. "Someone who truly understands this company from the ground up." Then he offered me the CEO position. I was 36 years old. The youngest chief executive in Callaway's entire recorded history. I kept my expression calm and professional while he spoke. On the outside I was still and measured. Inside my mind had already jumped 3 steps ahead. When the board formally announced my appointment the following week, they applauded and posed for photographs and issued a glowing press statement. But I noticed something in that room during the announcement that nobody else seemed to pay attention to. Several board members did not look pleased. They looked irritated. Not at the decision itself, but at the specific person the decision had landed on. Like they had pictured someone different. Someone who would be easier to manage from above. I stored that look away carefully and said nothing at all. I had a company to fix. And a contract to negotiate with extreme care. The board's legal team delivered my employment contract 2 days after the announcement. It was 43 pages long. Most executives in my position would have flipped to the compensation section, confirmed the numbers, and signed everything before the end of the week. The legal team's entire tone suggested that was exactly what they expected me to do. I did not flip to the compensation section. I read every page from the beginning. Then I read them again. Late one night, alone at my kitchen table with coffee that had gone stone cold an hour earlier, I thought about Dale Forrester. About the cardboard box. About Victor's easy smile and those 3 quiet words, timing matters in business. I called my attorney, a precise and experienced woman named Frances Doyle, and asked her to add 1 clause before I put my signature on anything. Section 12B. It stated clearly that if I were terminated without cause within 90 days of a scheduled performance milestone, my full bonus would become immediately due and payable. It also stated that any dispute over that clause would automatically trigger an independent financial audit of the entire company. Frances submitted the revised contract the following morning without any fanfare. The board signed it back within 24 hours. Not one person raised a question about the new language. Not one. And with that signature, they had agreed to something they did not yet understand at all. The company I stepped into as CEO was not simply struggling. It was bleeding from several directions at once, and most of the wounds had been quietly ignored for far too long. Callaway's 3 main divisions were all losing money at the same time. Our largest operation, a logistics division that was supposed to anchor everything else, had lost over $8 million in the previous year alone. Our internal technology systems were years out of date. Staff turnover was at record levels, and half the senior managers had been in their current roles for fewer than 18 months. The board had hired me to fix all of it, but they had no real interest in understanding how broken things truly were beneath the surface. My first week, I cancelled 4 expensive outside contracts that were providing almost no measurable value. I also restructured the senior leadership team. My second week, I walked every floor of every building Callaway operated in. I sat with people nobody in leadership had spoken to in years. The warehouse supervisors. The overnight operations staff. The junior financial analysts who had been identifying serious problems and sending reports into a silence that never once replied. Those conversations became the most valuable hours of my first month. Because those people knew exactly where everything was broken. And once I understood that fully, I could start fixing things from the bottom up. The work was relentless. I was in before sunrise most mornings. Some nights I was the last person left in the building. But slowly, the numbers began to move. By the end of my second year, Callaway's revenue had grown by 34%. Business publications ran my photograph and used phrases like turnaround story and remarkable recovery. Investors who had been preparing quiet exits were now talking about new expansion plans. Inside the company, something had shifted in the hallways in a way you could feel before you could measure. People moved with more purpose. They stayed late because they wanted to, not because they were afraid. But inside the boardroom, a very different atmosphere was forming. Victor started interrupting me more during presentations. Not with sharp questions or useful challenges, just with comments that had no real purpose except to remind the room that he was present and that his opinion still mattered above everyone else's. Howard Pike, who sat 2 seats to Victor's left, began requesting duplicate reports. The same financial data I had already submitted, repackaged and re-explained, as if the first version had somehow been insufficient. Approvals that used to come back in 1 day now took a full week for no explained reason. Projects I had marked as urgent sat in approval queues untouched. I told myself initially that this was normal friction. Boards become cautious when growth moves quickly. But there was something different underneath those patterns. My success was making certain people in that room quietly, deeply uncomfortable. And I had learned long ago that uncomfortable people in positions of power were the most dangerous kind. Exactly 2 years after I took the CEO role, Calloway Industries officially hit its first major growth milestone. Revenue was up significantly. Long-term debt was down. We had signed 3 large new contracts that locked in our biggest division for 5 years forward. Financial analysts were publishing pieces calling Calloway a model case study for corporate recovery. By every standard anyone could measure, it was a real and genuine success. The office celebrated properly that week. There were flowers at reception. The staff gathered in the main hall, and the cheer that went up was the kind that only comes from genuine relief, the particular sound of people who worked hard for something finally seeing it happen. The board applauded during the formal milestone review. Victor himself stood at the front of the room and described my leadership as remarkable. He used the word extraordinary. He shook my hand for the cameras and smiled wide enough for everyone in the room to see. But I watched his eyes while he smiled. They were not celebrating. They were calculating. I thought about Section 12B. About the payout clause linked directly to this milestone. About the final date it created, exactly 2 years from today, when my $500,000 performance bonus would officially become payable. I looked at Victor's practiced smile one more time. Then I looked away and kept my face completely still. Because some things are more powerful when they are left completely unsaid. 3 months before my bonus payout date, a senior executive named Barry Olson pulled me aside after a strategy meeting. Barry had been with Calloway for 11 years. He was not the kind of person who gossiped or created unnecessary noise. He spoke carefully and only when something genuinely needed to be said. He waited until the hallway outside the boardroom was completely clear before he spoke. "I don't want to alarm you," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "But I think you should be aware of something. The board has been holding private meetings. Without you present." I kept my face completely neutral. "How many?" I asked. "At least 3 that I know of. All in the past 6 weeks. Technically, a board had the legal right to meet without its CEO present. It was unusual, but it was not against any rule. Still, those 3 words, 6 weeks, private meetings, sat in my stomach like cold, heavy stones. 6 weeks after the milestone celebration. 3 undisclosed meetings. And my bonus payout sitting clearly on the calendar 2 months from that day. I thanked Barry quietly and asked him to keep his eyes open. That evening at home, I pulled out my copy of the employment contract and read Section 12B one careful time. The language was clean. The clause was exactly as Francis and I had written it. I closed the folder and told myself to be patient. The moment was not yet right. After Barry's warning, I began watching the patterns inside the boardroom much more closely and much more carefully. What I observed over the following weeks was not loud or dramatic. There was no single moment I could point to and say, that is where everything changed. It was quieter and slower and more deliberate than that. Like weight building behind something that had not yet cracked open. Budget requests I submitted on Mondays started returning on Thursdays with attached questions. Questions that required no more than 10 minutes to write, not a full week to formulate. A technology upgrade I had proposed months earlier, one that 3 separate department heads had already reviewed and approved, was suddenly flagged for additional review. Nobody could explain who had raised the concern or what specifically still needed examining. Victor started copying Howard onto every single email thread that passed through the board, including routine operational communications that had absolutely nothing to do with Howard's area of responsibility. And in meetings, both men had started writing things down. Not notes about the business being discussed. Notes about me. About specific things I said. About how I responded to questions. About whether I paused before answering. I recognized exactly what that was because I had watched it done to someone else in that same room. They were building a paper record. Not a record of wrongdoing on my part, there was none to find. A record designed to justify a decision they had already made somewhere behind a closed door. The annual investor presentation was held in the ballroom of a hotel in the center of the city. I had spent 3 full weeks preparing every slide, every number, every line. The room was filled with fund managers, industry analysts, a row of journalists near the back wall, and the full board seated along a side table to the right of the stage. The presentation went perfectly. When the final slide appeared, 4 years of consistent growth, improved margins, and a clear forward projection, the room broke into long building applause. The genuine kind. The kind that fills a space completely and lingers. Afterward, there was a reception. Investors sought me out across the room and said that Calloway felt like a completely different company. Several called it the strongest presentation they had attended in years. I was near the far end of the bar speaking with a fund manager from out of state when I became aware of two voices close behind me. I did not turn around. I recognized both voices immediately. Victor's was low and deliberately relaxed, the specific register people use when they believe no one important is listening nearby. 2 weeks, he said. A short pause. Then Howard, quieter. And it's done. Nothing more. I set my glass down very slowly on the bar surface. 2 weeks. My bonus payout date was exactly 14 days from that evening. I knew with complete certainty what that countdown was counting toward. I did not go straight home after the reception. I sat in my car in the hotel parking garage for 22 minutes with the engine off and the building humming silently around me. My mind moved through everything in careful order. The investor presentation had been that evening. My performance bonus payout date was printed clearly in Section 4 of my contract, 14 days from tonight. Victor's 2 words had not been vague. They had not been about a client or a vendor or a quarterly close. They were a countdown to something already decided in one of those private meetings Barry had told me about. I opened my phone calendar and counted the days forward slowly. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the employment contract. I had started carrying it 3 weeks earlier, and read Section 12B one final time under the parking garage's flat white light. Termination without cause within 90 days of a performance milestone. Full bonus immediately payable. Independent financial audit triggered automatically upon any dispute. I sat in that quiet concrete space and felt something settle through me. Not triumph. Not anger. Not even satisfaction. Just the particular calm that comes when you have prepared for a specific moment, and that moment is now exactly 2 weeks away. I had done everything right. Now I simply had to wait. The next morning I drove to the office at my usual time. I greeted the receptionist by name the way I always did. I poured my own coffee in the break room and said good morning to the overnight security team on their way out. I reviewed my daily schedule, sent 3 routine emails, and attended the 8:30 operations briefing without missing a single beat. Nobody in that building would have noticed anything different about me. But everything was different. After the briefing, I sent a short message to Frances Doyle. No details. Just 4 words, I think it is soon. She replied within the hour, ready when you are. That afternoon I made 3 separate copies of my employment contract and stored them in different locations, one in my home safe, one with Frances at her office, and one in a secure personal cloud account with no connection to any of Calloway's internal systems. I backed up every email, every performance report, and every board approval I had submitted or received across 4 years onto a personal external drive. I took nothing belonging to the company, only what had always been mine. Then I walked back to my desk, finished my afternoon emails, prepared the agenda for the following week's meeting, and left at my regular time. I was not going to run. I was not going to create a scene. I was not going to hand them a single thing to add to the paper record they had been quietly building against me. I was simply going to be ready. The board meeting was called for a Tuesday morning. Nothing about the scheduling looked unusual from the outside. Tuesdays were standard. The agenda had arrived in my inbox the previous Thursday, formatted exactly the same as every other week. I wore the navy blazer I had bought the year we hit our first real profit target. I arrived 6 minutes early. I placed my folder on the table at the head of the room and sat down. The board members came in one by one. Not one of them made eye contact with me. I had been in enough important meetings to understand exactly what that meant. When 8 people enter a room and none of them look at the person they came to face, the decision sitting in that room was settled long before anyone arrived. Victor came in last. He took his seat without a word. Then he cleared his throat. Lauren. Not Ms. Whitaker. Lauren, which somehow made the whole thing feel more studied, more deliberate. The board has taken a vote. He slid a brown envelope across the polished table toward me. Effective immediately, you are being removed as CEO of Calloway Industries. He let the words sit in the room for a moment. Then the second part came. As you are no longer in the CEO role, The performance bonus scheduled for next month is no longer applicable. He delivered it calmly and cleanly, the way someone delivers a line they have rehearsed until it no longer feels like anything at all. I picked up the envelope from the table without opening it. The 2 security guards waited by the door with the stiff discomfort of men who had not asked for this assignment. I gathered my folder and my phone, stood, and walked toward the exit without saying a single word to anyone in the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Victor watched me the entire way to the door. I did not look back once. The elevator ride down took 40 seconds. I counted every one of them to keep my hands from shaking visibly. That evening I sat at my kitchen table, the exact same table where I had added the clause to my contract 4 years earlier, and opened the employment agreement one final time. Section 12B. Right there. Exactly where Francis and I had placed it. If the CEO is terminated without cause within 90 days of a scheduled performance milestone, the full bonus amount shall become immediately payable. Any dispute arising from this clause shall automatically initiate an independent third-party financial audit of the company. I read the paragraph twice. Then I picked up my phone and called Francis. They did it, I said. A brief pause on the line. How many days before your payout date? She asked. 14, I said. She exhaled once, slow and steady. Then let's begin. And just like that, the second half of everything started. Francis moved quickly. Within 48 hours she had drafted a formal legal notice addressed to the full board of directors of Calloway Industries. It was clean, direct, and completely without ambiguity. No aggressive language. No lengthy legal arguments built to intimidate. Just the facts and the contract, laid side by side, leaving absolutely no room for misreading. 2 paragraphs. 1 invoice. The first paragraph cited Section 12B of my employment agreement by name and stated plainly that my termination without cause, occurring 14 days before a scheduled performance milestone, had triggered the full and immediate payment of my bonus. The second paragraph formally requested the initiation of the independent financial audit as required under the same clause. The invoice was attached below. $500,000. Payable within 30 days. Francis sent it by certified mail and confirmed electronic delivery to the board's legal department on a Friday afternoon at 4:47 p.m. I was sitting on my back porch when she called to confirm everything had gone through. It is done, she said. I was holding a mug of tea and watching the late afternoon light shift slowly across the garden. How do you think they will respond? I asked. Francis paused for just a moment. They will push back at first, she said. They always believe they have a stronger position than they actually do. And do they have one? No, she said simply. They do not. I set my mug down carefully on the railing. Good, I said. Let them figure that out on their own. The board's response arrived 9 days later. It came from their legal firm, a name I recognized, well known throughout the city for aggressive strategies and very expensive hourly rates. The letter ran 4 full pages and dressed everything in thick formal language, but the actual message inside it was very straightforward. They refused to pay. Their argument was that my termination had voided the employment agreement entirely, which they claimed made Section 12 be unenforceable from the moment I stepped out of the building. It was not a strong legal argument. In fact, it was precisely the argument Francis had predicted they would make. And it was precisely the argument that Section 12B had been specifically written to defeat. The clause did not disappear upon termination. That was the entire reason it existed in the first place. But something else mattered far more than the weakness of their legal theory. Their refusal to pay had triggered the audit. Not as an option. Not as something either side could choose to pursue or set aside. As a binding contractual requirement they had agreed to the day they signed my employment contract without reading it carefully. Disputing the clause did not give them a way out. Under the exact terms of the agreement, disputing the clause activated the audit automatically and immediately. Francis filed the necessary paperwork that same afternoon. Within 2 weeks, a senior team of independent financial auditors had been formally assigned to Calloway Industries. They were given full access to 4 years of company records. And they began to dig. The auditors worked steadily for 3 full weeks before the first discovery came to the surface. Francis called me on a Thursday morning and told me to sit down before she said anything else. I was already seated, but I understood what she meant. The auditors had located a consulting contract buried deep inside Calloway's operational expense records. It had been approved quietly, completely outside the standard approval channels, with no formal board vote recorded anywhere in the official minutes. The contract was worth $3.4 million. It had been personally signed and authorized by Victor Langford. The consulting firm receiving those payments was called Greystone Advisory Partners. Greystone Advisory Partners was partially owned by Victor Langford. A sitting board member had personally authorized a multimillion-dollar payment to a company in which he held a direct financial stake. At no point had he disclosed that interest to the rest of the board, to shareholders, or to anyone else with a connection to Calloway. That was not a paperwork error. That was not a confused approval chain. That was a deliberate, undisclosed conflict of interest that had been hidden inside the company's records for years. Francis told me the auditors were now expanding their review to cover all board-approved contracts across the full 4-year period. Does Victor know they found it yet? I asked. Not yet, she said. I thought briefly about his confident face as he watched me walk out with the security guards. He will very soon, I said. 2 weeks after the first discovery, the auditors surfaced something even larger. Howard Pike, the board member who had spent months carefully writing down every word I said during meetings, had personally approved a long series of expense reimbursements made out to an outside vendor called Blue Line Solutions. The approvals had been processed consistently across a period of 28 months. The total value was $2.1 million. The auditors investigated Blue Line Solutions completely. They found a registered business address in a state where Calloway had no operations of any kind. No company website. No employees recorded anywhere. No physical office anyone could locate or verify. No services of any kind ever delivered to Calloway or documented in any internal system. It was a shell company. $2.1 million had been paid out to a business that did not appear to function in any real way at all. And Howard Pike had personally signed off on every single approval. Francis walked me through both findings together on the phone. The auditors had formally referred both matters to legal counsel and had notified the company's interim leadership group. I did not feel triumphant when she finished explaining. That surprised me genuinely. What settled over me instead was a quiet, tired heaviness. The kind that comes when something you suspected turns out to be significantly worse than anything you had actually imagined. These were not panicked mistakes made under financial pressure. These were deliberate choices made by men who believed they would never face a single consequence. News of the audit leaked. I was not the one who leaked it. But inside a company being examined from the inside out by an outside team, information does not stay contained for long. A source passed something to a financial journalist. The story ran on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, Calloway's stock had fallen 11%. By Friday it was down 18%. Investors who had shaken my hand warmly in that hotel ballroom just weeks earlier were now making urgent phone calls demanding answers that nobody could provide. The investor relations team was fielding dozens of calls every single day and had nothing reassuring to offer. Victor issued a public statement through the company's communications department. It was carefully worded and deliberately measured. The audit was described as routine. The board had full confidence in the company's financial integrity. I read the statement from my kitchen table. His name was still signed to the bottom of it, which meant either he had not yet been fully briefed on exactly what the auditors had found, or he had been briefed and still believed he could shape the story around it through carefully chosen public language. Either way, the ground beneath Calloway's entire leadership structure was shifting faster and harder than any press statement could manage. This was no longer something happening quietly behind closed doors. It was happening in full daylight, in full public view, and there was absolutely no containing it anymore. 3 weeks after the audit findings became public, a coalition of major shareholders filed a formal lawsuit against the board of Calloway Industries. The lawsuit did not mention my bonus at all. That detail, I think, surprised the board more than anything else that had happened. The shareholders were not filing on my behalf. They were not fighting for the $500,000 the board had tried to withhold from me. They were filing because the independent audit had produced hard documented evidence that board members had personally directed company funds toward their own undisclosed financial interests, while publicly presenting Calloway to investors as a sound and well-governed organization. The legal term was breach of fiduciary duty. The financial exposure in that lawsuit was not $500,000. It ran into several millions when the full liability picture came into focus. Frances called me the morning the lawsuit became public knowledge. The investigation is being expanded, she said. Regulatory authorities are now directly involved. How many board members are named? I asked. 4 initially, she said. Victor and Howard are at the top of that list. I thought briefly about Dale Forrester walking out of that boardroom years ago with a cardboard box while the board quietly congratulated themselves on their perfect timing. I wondered how long those records had been sitting inside the company's systems, completely undisturbed, waiting patiently for someone to finally look. Victor Langford resigned on a Friday afternoon. The announcement came through a short company press release with no personal statement attached. No explanation. No context. No acknowledgement of what had been found. Just a single paragraph confirming he had stepped down from the board effective immediately and that an interim oversight committee would manage board responsibilities during the transition. I was sitting in Frances's office when her assistant forwarded the release. Frances read it, set her phone face down on the desk, and looked at me across the table. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. Howard Pike resigned the following Monday. Then 2 additional board members within the same week, both of whom the auditors had noted had been aware of the Greystone Advisory Partners arrangement and had raised no objection when the contract was originally approved. Within 30 days of Victor's resignation, 5 of Calloway's 8 board members had stepped away from their positions. The board that had sat in those leather chairs and voted to remove me, confident, in complete control, entirely certain they had already won, was publicly falling apart piece by piece. Not because of a confrontation in a hallway. Not because of a whistleblower or a leaked recording or a journalist with a well-placed source. Because of 2 paragraphs in an employment contract they had signed without reading carefully. Because of 1 clause added by a woman they had decided to underestimate from the very beginning. Sometimes that is genuinely all it takes. The settlement offer came through Frances on a Tuesday morning, 11 weeks after the audit had formally begun. Calloway's new interim leadership team, a small group of outside executives brought in specifically to stabilize operations while the board situation was resolved, had reached out to Frances the previous week. Their message was simple and without any drama attached to it. They wanted to close the dispute cleanly and move forward. Frances and I met in her office to go through the proposed terms together, side by side. My $500,000 bonus would be paid in full. With interest. The interest calculation ran from my original payout date forward through the exact date of settlement, covering the entire period during which the money had been unlawfully held for me. Frances had also negotiated a formal written acknowledgement from the company confirming that my termination had been without cause. That acknowledgement was important to me beyond any dollar figure. It protected my professional record completely and confirmed on the record that Section 12B had been validly and correctly triggered. I read through every page of the settlement document before I picked up the pen. Old habit. Same kitchen table, 4 years earlier. When I finished I set the pen down and looked out the window at the city spread out below in the morning light. I was not celebrating. Not exactly. But there was a quietness inside me that had not been present for a very long time. The specific quietness of something that had ended exactly the way it was always supposed to. In the months that followed, the consequences settled into place with a slow, steady finality that no one involved could rush or redirect. The regulatory investigation concluded with substantial financial fines leveled against 3 former board members for securities violations related to the undisclosed conflicts of interest the audit had brought to light. Victor Langford and Howard Pike were both permanently banned from serving on the board of any publicly traded company going forward. Calloway Industries survived, but barely. The new board assembled from outside the company spent the better part of a full year rebuilding investor trust, restructuring 2 divisions that had been quietly mismanaged under the old regime for years, and repairing the internal culture that self-serving leadership had slowly worn down from above. Several of the people I had hired and promoted during my 4 years remained in the building when everything finally settled. Barry Olson, who had pulled me aside in an empty corridor and told me about the private board meetings at a time when he had nothing personal to gain from doing so, was elevated into a senior leadership role under the new structure. He sent me a short email the morning that was announced. "You were right to trust the contract," it read. Nothing more than that. I sat with that message for a while and thought about the 4 years. The long days. The missed weekends. The board members who had applauded in public while quietly deciding I had served my purpose. And I thought about Dale Forrester. I hoped wherever he had landed, he had found something better. 6 months after the settlement was signed, I was standing in a new office on the 14th floor of a building I had never once set foot in before. The walls were bare. The desk was empty. The windows looked out over a different part of the city, not better or worse than the view I had known for 4 years. Just different. New in the particular way that only comes when something has genuinely been earned. The company had grown from an idea I had been turning over quietly in the back of my mind for years. Small at first. A focused team. A clear direction. No inherited problems and no board sitting above me that resented the person solving those problems on their behalf. The $500,000 that Calloway had tried to keep, the money they had removed me specifically to avoid paying, had helped build the foundation of it. There was something I genuinely liked about that fact. Not as revenge. Revenge is loud and it burns energy you cannot afford to lose. As a reminder. Because the real lesson inside all of this had nothing to do with legal strategy or financial audits or perfectly written contract clauses. It was much simpler than any of that. The people who work hardest to push you out are almost always the exact same people quietly building the trap that will eventually bring them down. They count on you being too hurt or too shocked or too exhausted to think clearly in the moment. They forget that preparation made in silence is the only kind they never see coming. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step aside, stay completely calm, and let arrogant people destroy themselves with their own hands.